So for the first time in the Starship testing process, I am angry. And I'm not angry about SN8. I mean, that was our first attempt at a landing, and it could be expected, really, that something like that was going to happen. I'd be really shocked if it didn't. And as a matter of fact, it came very close to being successful. No, how could I possibly be angry about that? And after all, there's no way that I could possibly be angry about SN9 either, even though this landing was substantially worse than the one previously. It was still an early test, and really nothing to get angry about, except for the fact that SN10 was sitting right there, but I'm all over being angry about that particular issue. Let's move on. This is the flight that has me angry, SN10. I had grown to know and love this ship. And yeah, some shaky camera work, but at the same time, you try to film something that's several kilometers up in the atmosphere this close. Pretty amazing stuff in my opinion, but as you can see, the heat tiles were staying on very well. A lot of positive things about this flight, and oh, they came so close. And as I said, I got so close to this ship. I mean, I did a lot of live streams close to it. I photographed it. This was my buddy, my pal, and they came so close to landing it successfully, but sadly, because of landing legs that just weren't up to the job and a number of other factors, it just didn't make it, although it certainly appeared to, at least at first. But, and these are Elon's words and not mine, SN10 engine was low on thrust due, probably, to partial helium ingestion from fuel header tank, impact of 10 meters per second, crushed legs, and part of skirt. Multiple fixes in work for SN11. And really, as the smoke clears here, you can see just how precariously SN10 was leaning. Frankly, I'm kind of surprised that it didn't topple over, and in the end, it was probably a good thing that it did explode, because I wouldn't have wanted to be the person making the decision as to whether or not to send recovery crews out to a ship that was so clearly about to topple over. Such a close thing. Oh well, so long, pal. But later on, as Zeus and the boys started the cleanup process of SN10, oh, it hurts to watch these images. More information was revealed by Elon as to what caused it, as to why there was helium in the header tanks to begin with. Quote, helium in header was used to prevent ullage collapse from slosh, which happened in prior flight. My fault for approving sounded good at the time. Huh? Well, in case you're wondering what all of that means, ullage is defined as the volume of vapor above a liquid in a sealed storage tank, while ullage volume collapse is the process of stirring the contents of a cryogenic liquid tank to reduce pressure. Now, that's the conventional definition, but in this case, sloshing around of liquid and ullage collapse that goes with it is something that would probably happen when you're sloshing the fuel around while going from a belly flop to a vertical position, which is something that they're trying to avoid in order to maintain the pressure necessary to feed fuel to the engines. So the last-second decision to add helium pressurant to the header tanks was designed to keep that pressure maintained on the fuel so that it would keep feeding into the engines during the landing process. But it appears that the engine started to consume the helium as well, reducing the thrust and leading to the violent landing. Now that has nothing to do with a methane leak, but that's reason enough for a failed landing, at least in the long run. But what about SN11? Is it getting better landing legs than the one you're looking at right now? Have they made fixes to the engines, to the header tank pressure? And is all of this going to work on this last test before SN15? Well, the answer to all of those questions is connected to what is, in my opinion, the most important serial number test to date. And we're going to find out about all of that in just a few minutes. Good morning, and welcome to yet another episode of the Angry Astronaut. I am continuing to plow out content as fast as I can, just because, again, there's so much happening. Even if I was only covering SpaceX, it would be a non-stop job, as it is for a lot of other people, just because their pace of development is absolutely crazy. And I haven't even really talked about Falcon 9 and Starlink and everything associated with that. I mean, there's been a lot of development with that as well that I need to get to, so enough to keep somebody extremely busy. But here we are at SN11, and as you've seen from the intro and from the thumbnail that I have for this video, etc., this is, in my opinion, the most important test to date. And the reason for that is the primary objective of the serial number prototypes that have come up to this point, and really including SN11 when it was originally conceived, was to determine whether or not Starship had the ability to maneuver through the atmosphere after performing the belly flop to see whether or not they could bring it back to the launch pad. I've said that quite a number of times, and obviously they've been able to do this. Really, they could have stopped with serial number 9 or 10 if that's all they wanted to accomplish. But clearly, that's not all that they want to accomplish. If it was, then they wouldn't bother putting heat tiles, for example, on the vessel. They wouldn't bother putting landing legs on it, but they have. Landing is an important part of the process, extremely important, regardless of what anybody might have to say. Obviously, SpaceX has included landing as being an important aspect of this phase of the testing. And so far, although they've come close, they have not been successful in carrying out landing an intact Starship. Yes, they did land SN10, but it was not intact on landing. And I think I made that pretty clear in my last video and also kind of in the intro. So really, SN11 is the last opportunity that SpaceX has in order to carry out a perfect landing, sticking the landing, as I said over and over in another video, before they graduate to SN15, an entirely new prototype with all kinds of new modifications, many of which have really been kept secret from the public. I'm hoping that they include vacuum Raptor engines and flights to much higher altitudes, but that is pure speculation on my part, and by the way, not shared by a lot of people. But I think it's important that they test those vacuum Raptors in flight as soon as possible. But I'm not SpaceX, so hard to say. But to get back to it, SN11 is their last chance to stick a landing before they change Starship significantly, add a number of very significant modifications, whatever they may be, and then try to fly and land that. So it'll be an entirely new Starship flying with SN15, and hopefully they will be flying it with a complete examination of SN11. At post-flight examination, perhaps they'll even be able to fly it again to check reusability at this early stage, because Elon has emphasized the importance of reusability, rapid reusability, so many times. Why not try to fly SN11 again if they can carry out a perfect landing? I certainly hope they can, but I'm going to explain to you in detail the modifications that have been made very quickly, actually, to SN11 to try to increase the likelihood of a successful landing and my opinion of whether or not they're going to be successful. So get ready to wade into the world of SN11. Now, to understand the colossal challenge behind a Starship landing, you have to understand the fuel system, the plumbing, so to speak. Now, the main flight is fueled by a combination of liquid methane and liquid oxygen. The liquid oxygen is contained in a main tank at the bottom of the ship, and then the liquid methane, and there's substantially less of that, is located elsewhere. And you could see also that there is a liquid methane header tank. And so Starship runs off of both of those, the methane being the fuel and the oxygen being the oxidizer. And there's the liquid oxygen header tank. And the purpose of the header tanks is to have a smaller tank where it's easier to maintain pressure during a landing, especially during the violent maneuver of going from horizontal to vertical right before the Starship touches down. But they've still had a difficult time maintaining that pressure, which is one of the reasons why the helium was added at the last minute, but it's being taken away now. So you have the main tanks for the flight and the header tanks for the landing. Theoretically, it should work. In practice, it has yet to work. SN8 crashed because of a lack of pressure in the liquid oxygen header tank. SN9 crashed because one of the engines failed to light. Now, was this caused by the same pressure? Hard to say. And SN10 failed because they added helium to the mix to try to increase the pressure, but the engine started consuming that, and that led to a drop in thrust. And by the way, please support this talented guy any way you can. Alright, so back to SN11. How is this situation not going to be repeated, especially since the helium, which was supposed to increase the pressure in the header tanks in the first place, has now been removed? Well, Elon is talking about a lot of fixes, including fixes to the landing legs, which have been observed apparently. On top of that, fixes to the engines, perhaps adjusting the throttle a bit to give them a little bit more power during the descent. A variety of different things being implemented. And of course, then the pressure, that has got to be something that they're focusing on in the header tanks if they're going to have any chance of successfully landing SN11. And there's a lot of things to indicate that they intend to land SN11 successfully and intact. And this becomes very apparent when you start looking at the heat tiles on SN11. I mean, look at all of these things. It can't even fit them into one picture frame. And you don't put this many heat tiles on a prototype unless you intend to recover it. And I think that SpaceX really wants to recover SN11 intact. There's so much information that we simply don't know about the tiles. Is the mounting system effective? Or do they need to use a different sort of mounting system, as is, I think, the case with this particular patch and some of the other patches on the ship? Do the tiles crack during flight when they go through max Q or during a landing? So far, we don't know, because the tiles keep getting blown to bits, and that's something that needs to change very soon. And check this out. For the first time, a patch of heat tiles on a flap. And this is something that the Starship is going to need as well. Every little bit of this vessel is going to have to be protected from the intense heat of re-entry, at least the side that's subjected to the majority of the atmospheric heat. And by the way, I'm very interested as to how they're going to protect the hinges that join the flaps to the rest of the vessel from the same kind of heat. I think it's going to be a very difficult challenge, and one they have yet to address. Perhaps we're going to try to do that with SN15. We'll have to see. Now, it would be very convenient if the destruction of SN8, SN9, and SN10 all had the same root cause, the header tank pressure issues. That certainly is what caused the destruction, or RUD, of SN8. The loss of pressure in the oxygen header tank and the engine starting to eat itself with that characteristic green color. SN9 is more complicated. An engine failed to light. Was that because there wasn't enough pressure feeding sufficient fuel into the engine? Well, it wouldn't seem so, but at the same time, if that wasn't the cause, then why would they have added helium into the header tanks with SN10 in order to try to artificially increase the pressure? Regardless, according to Elon, because they introduced this artificial method of trying to increase the pressure, that in turn led to SN10's hard landing. Not necessarily its subsequent destruction, though, because there is one important fact that we're forgetting in the midst of all of these particular landings. And that, of course, is the mysterious methane leak and the fire that followed. I find this to be one of the most disturbing aspects of the SN10 flight. Why did this happen? Was it the violent nature of the maneuver that takes Starship from a horizontal belly flop to a vertical landing position? Regardless of the reason, the fire was clearly going before SN10 got anywhere near the ground. And the fire, of course, continued to burn in spite of all efforts made to suppress it until it finally destroyed the ship. And yeah, I'm going to use the term destroyed instead of RUD because it is kind of serious. Because the viability of this landing process is going to be the key as to whether or not Starship can land on a planet with an atmosphere, at least with its current design. And this has been the case from the very beginning, and why I've been so focused on the landing from the very beginning is because it is so unconventional and so challenging from an aerodynamic and rocket design standpoint. It's just a very difficult thing to do. Let's hope that these problems can be tracked down to one central cause that can be easily fixed, because if they can't, a significant redesign of the Starship and the delays associated with it may be necessary. And so this is why the ship that you're looking at right now, SN11, and these little patches of heat tiles, even on the other side of the flaps for some reason, is so critical to the development of Starship. If this vessel manages to complete a flight and land completely intact to where it can be launched again, then, in my opinion, the Starship development program can move on confident that all of the initial problems have been solved. However, if it does not, then SN15 is going to move forward with old problems still lingering. And who knows when those problems are going to be solved. And in my opinion also, there's more than one problem that we're looking at. It goes beyond header tank pressure issues. There could be issues that cause the fire, whether it be the equipment being too delicate for the initial maneuver for the landing process, or something else. And why didn't the engine fire on SN9? Was it really a pressure issue, or was it something else? If it indeed was a number of different factors that have contributed to the failures of SN8 through SN10, and please don't misunderstand me when I say failure. They've actually been tremendous successes in so many ways, but not complete successes, not unqualified successes. And that's what we're looking for in the initial stages of this development process before we move on to something more ambitious and more sophisticated. So everything is riding on this ship. If it's successful, I think we can move on, although I'd prefer 2 successful landings. If not, then SN15 may be plagued by the same problems that plagued SN8 for a long time to come. And rest assured, I have not forgotten the amazing accomplishments of this test program thus far. Starship's ability to maneuver through the atmosphere with such incredible precision, the performance of the Raptors thus far, everything is so promising. But I cannot talk about the positives without also talking about the negatives, not without putting my credibility at risk as far as I'm concerned as somebody who both reports on space issues and also gives his honest opinions. Starship is still a project in development. Space is hard, and this groundbreaking vehicle especially so. So what am I saying here? That SN11 is doomed? Well, no, not at all. There's a lot of very good, very intelligent, very well-educated people over at SpaceX who are doing their level best to see to it that SN11 does stick the landing and is sufficiently intact in order to be able to try a second flight. I really believe that that's what they intend to carry out. But what I also believe, given the rapidity of SN11 being sent out to the pad with these modifications that must have been put into place over the course of just a few days, that suggests to me that Elon wants to get this stage of the test out of the way. He wants these early serial number Starships to be over with, and he wants to graduate to SN15, which is closer to his vision, in my opinion, of what Starship will eventually be than any of these earlier prototypes. Now, that is, of course, his decision to make, and I think that there's a number of, things to be said in favor of that. But I feel a little bit of regret that SN12, 13, and 14 were canceled. I think that it would have been nice to have seen at least a couple of successful landings before we graduated to more advanced versions of the Starship, because we still have some unanswered questions. Can you take something this heavy, this big of a piece of stainless steel, descending from such a height at such a velocity, and then to carry out such a violent maneuver from the belly flop to a vertical position, engaging the engines at the same time with, and some people have talked about this, the fuel sloshing around? Can you do all of these things and carry out a successful landing time and again? Well, we haven't answered that question yet, or at least so far the answer has been no. Now, I'm confident it can ultimately be done, but I think that it could have been done with these earlier versions of Starship before we added more modifications to the vessel, before determining if anything really significant had to be done to the design to increase the chance of a successful landing. Now, perhaps SN15 represents some of those changes. I don't know. I don't think any of us do, except for the insiders at SpaceX. So, it could be that SN, 12 and so on should have been canceled, that there was nothing else to learn. But given the fact that we still have heat tiles all over the vessel, even the flaps this time, I think that SpaceX would really like to recover one of these things intact and study it before they move on to a more advanced version of the ship. But Elon is an impatient man, and this is one of the things that have made him so successful. And so he wants to move on with the project, landing or no landing. And this is just him throwing the dice like he always does, and he's oftentimes successful, and I think that there's a decent chance that he'll be successful this time as well. But still, one thing I'd really like to see him try, just once, have the ship come down vertically and see exactly how much fuel it would require to slow it down and then dial down the engines from 3 to 1 and the throttle, of course, and then just carry out a Falcon 9-like landing. How much fuel would that require? I think it would be an interesting experiment, and also just to see if landing under those circumstances would be a lot easier. I think it probably would be, but would it be worth the trade-off in fuel? Obviously, SpaceX doesn't seem to think so, but given that that's how the Starship is going to have to land on the moon because there's no atmosphere, I think it's worth looking into regardless. But once again, that's my opinion, and I have a lot of those, and oftentimes I'm wrong. But if you like watching my opinions, whether they be right or wrong, you know how to support me. It's all in the description, and you're seeing a list of few of my latest supporters in Patreon. Thank you so much for supporting this channel. And with any luck, I'm going to be heading to Mississippi to watch what is hopefully going to be a successful green run, assuming, of course, that I can find a vantage point where I can see the test stand, which I think is going to be quite a challenge in itself. But until we have a successful test from beginning to end, a successful flight and a successful landing of an intact Starship that can be reused, because that's the whole point, isn't it? Until that moment arrives, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.